War won. More battles in Europe, more dead and more wounded. There is nothing new here, but a new force is arising through it, that of international communism. Lenin, smuggled through Germany with a handful of men in a boxcar, taking money from New York, was able to subvert the Kerensky Menshevik revolution that toppled the Tsar and turn Russia into the bloody platform from which the attack against the civilized world could be launched. The communist leaders harangued the masses, inciting them to rebel. The jails were emptied, and the criminals and insane together were freed to roam the streets. Hate and fear were the emotions the leaders sought from the masses, and they learned here in their initial base how they were best obtained. When the masses attacked the palace, they were rewarded and permitted to rape, murder, pillage, and burn. Like a spreading cancer, the tiny minority of communist leaders extended their control throughout the land. All opposition was destroyed. Some were sent to Siberia, and others were silenced by the grave. There was no counting the millions of innocent dead. But the goal was not Russia alone. It was, and according to their own words, is, total domination of the world. Soon Lenin and his forces stepped up their activities in all other countries, testing the forces in control. Germany, where the communists helped the mustached, paper-hanging corporal to rise to power, acting always according to the basic subversion instructions of Lenin. Then Lenin died, and a new communist boss was named, Joseph Stalin, equally brutal and working towards the same pre-established goal. Communists everywhere tested their strength, all obeying the central directives from Moscow. England, and then France, Mexico and South America, Cuba, where the fighting was fierce in the streets, United States. Here the workers were incited to hatred, and the police worked hard to try to keep order and just to stay alive. All of this was brought about by a tiny minority of hidden communists in each country, fanatically obeying the orders from Moscow. There was never a moment's doubt about their intentions to rule the world. Then it was time for Spain, where their handbook of red subversion would be truly written in blood. And the communists at this time needed a morale-boosting victory because Russia was falling apart at the seams. But would it be possible to uproot this strongly religious Spanish civilization that gave us great discoveries of new lands? And battles and victories like Lepanto, and universities like Salamanca, and architecture, music, dance, tradition, defense of the Christian faith, and above all, a keen sensibility of the ties of history that bind together the civilized world. Would it be possible to communize this land? But in the late 1920s, this was also the Spain of a weak monarchy and an even weaker king, Alfonso XIII. Instability was the order of the day, where governments and ministers played musical chairs every few weeks, and the door was open for change. A number of Spain's intellectuals, teachers, writers, poets, and critics had seen this in the offing and had become political liberals, speaking, dreaming, and clamoring for a pure democracy, with government-guided social change and government care for all. And finally, when government became impossible, a choice. A democracy under the name of a republic, or to continue with the king. The Spanish people, tired of constant riots and disorder, were to vote. The republic was proclaimed, the flag was changed, and the people cheered. King Alfonso went to England. And the communist propaganda artist worked even harder, seeing that they were approaching their goal of confusion and anarchy. Instead of the peace and progress for which the people had voted, within 3 weeks after the elections of April 1931, the communist agitators, still a tiny, hidden minority, had flooded the masses back into the streets. This time it was the new, untried republic that had to keep order if it could. By May the 11th, the tiny communist group had established such a network throughout Spain that they could burn 300 churches, convents, and monasteries in different towns and cities at the same time throughout the land. In many cases, the firemen were prevented from putting out the fires. In spite of this abundant evidence of a well-organized conspiracy, only 3 of the non-communist liberal intellectuals elected to a Spanish Congress of over 400 members were brave enough and honest enough to raise their voices to call the act what it was, communist subversion. The rest of the intellectual left accepted these simultaneous burnings as unplanned coincidence and remained quiet in the face of the beginnings of the destruction of their country and the destruction of their world. They could not bear to admit that they had been wrong. Even seeing the communist salutes of the raised, clenched fists and the churches and religious houses profaned, the so-called non-communist liberal intellectual held his tongue. Noting the instability of the liberal establishment to take truly firm measures, the tiny communist minority pushed even harder, knowing that they were in reality a small tail that would have to wag the dog. They agitated constantly to create hatred and fear. They burned and profaned and rioted. And they paid sentimental homage to their socialist leaders of the past. As they grew stronger, the communists began to expose their hitherto hidden hand. Ignorant men and women filled their ranks, and it appeared that the end of the Republic was near. At last, the communists felt ready for their final blow to topple the Republic, and they began it in the arms and munitions capital of Oviedo in Asturias in 1934. Factories were burned and bombed, and production was halted. Private property was set to the torch, and the communists, in fact, did gain control. The Revolutionary Committee immediately published the following orders. Anyone possessing arms shall appear immediately before the committee to identify himself. Anyone caught possessing arms at home or in the street without permission to bear them will be severely punished. The punishment, of course, was death. The communists knew that they had to disarm the town, and the orders continued. All articles of clothing and food are herewith confiscated by the Revolutionary Committee. With the appearance of this notice, the Red Army is hereby formed. All workers who wish to defend the proletarian cause may join. Those who have belonged to the exploiting, property-owning class are excluded. Our army will defeat the counter-revolutionaries in a brave, resolute manner in order to erect a socialist society. These orders show the true color of the revolution against the new and untried republic. The arms and munitions of this industrial center were distributed amongst the Reds. But the Republic, for all of its internal dissent, still had enough strength to crush a regional revolt, and it did. The Communists had taken their 2 steps forward and had been confronted. Now it was time to take a short step backwards, bide their time, and wait to try again. And as always, they left death and destruction in their wake. But there was no peace in the Republic. The factories produced nothing and money was worthless. Guaranteed minimum wages and government planning had failed. Riots and street fighting continued, and the people were again to vote. The communist minority leaped at the chance to use the confusion they had helped to create, and thus began the new politics of the left, the United Popular Front, a collection of minority groups. The Catalan and Basque minorities of the North were promised their own independent countries. The farmer of the South was promised his own government-confiscated lands. The labor unions and anarchists were promised their slice of the pie. And there was no end to the promises the politicians made. The Popular Front, which the communist minority controlled, won the elections of February 1936, and Spain's reign of terror was about to begin. Women paraded as soldiers, the clenched fist was lofted, and the communists had waited long enough. They were ready to consolidate their control. Calvo Sotelo, legally elected head of the opposition, was assassinated by the Reds. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera was to be later executed in his prison cell in Alicante. And other legally elected leaders of the anti-Popular Front combined in Congress were shot down in the street. As Lenin had taught them in Russia, the prisons were emptied, the incited masses armed, and hatred, vengeance, and fear blanketed the land. Spanish fleet was to mutiny, and the officers were to be imprisoned, and the communists were to control the seas. Many of these officers were later thrown overboard, their bodies to float ashore. Executions became commonplace for both personal and political reasons. And the goon squad Checas roamed the streets at night. The people found themselves helpless. They had been forced to register and then to surrender their arms. And abandoned bodies filled the parks and alleys daily, and women and children searched to find and mourn their dead. All of this in the name of the Popular Front Republic. Anyone suspected of so-called anti-Republican feelings was taken to the Checa jail to be questioned, tortured, and most likely later shot. Or driven insane from watching the spots and drawings on the wall in a cell where one could neither sit, nor lie down, nor walk. Or to be put into refrigerated cells to slowly freeze. Or perhaps to be put into cells with constant lights, uncomfortable positions, buzzers, and electric shocks, where there could be no sleep at all. Confronted with the murder, rape, burn, and pillage atmosphere that the Popular Front Republic had brought, the decent Spaniard had nowhere to turn. He was disarmed. His religion had been mocked and profaned, his treasures were stolen, and hoodlums controlled the streets. But there were some brave patriots who had seen this in the making. When it became known that the communists had prepared a final coup de grace for the so-called republic, and that they intended to deliver this blow and totally consolidate their power, making Spain a Soviet satellite, it was then or never time to act. Knowing that these extremes of horror were to be reached, some of Spain's patriot generals had begun the fight to deliver their country from the hands of the communist-controlled Popular Front. General Franco had taken his stand. And General Mola in the north at Pamplona. And General Quiepo de Llano in Sevilla of the south. These men were determined to return civilization and an honorable, productive peace to their land. The communists were caught by surprise. They had been beaten to the punch. The communists saw that they needed help or Spain would slip from their grasp. The international apparatus sent orders to all communist parties everywhere to send money, arms, and men to Spain, and to disguise their acts so that they would not be discovered until Spain was in the communist hands. Their propaganda would state that they fought for the Republic, and that was their official line. The communist parties and fellow traveler groups of 53 countries answered this call for help. Joseph Broz Tito, today's dictator of communist Yugoslavia, came. Holdos and Nekvasil of today's communist Czechoslovakia, Longo and Neni of today's Italy, André Marty, then head of the French Communist Party, Chanton and Trillion, later of the Fourth French Republic, Colonel Turunskik, an Opman of today's Communist Poland, and many, many other high-ranking officials throughout the communist and socialist world. Clement Attlee, later to be head of the British government, is shown here with his fists clenched in the communist salute, reviewing a parade of the Red troops. His letter of congratulations to the English troops fighting for the communists terminates with the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." Help also came from the communists and their dupes in the United States, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. This brigade was headed by Robert Merriman, a 28-year-old American communist. Archie Brown, West Coast communist, was also there to help the Reds, and so were many others. A few innocent, idealistic American students went to fight for what they thought was a true Spanish republic. When they later discovered that they had been beguiled into aiding the communists and they wanted to quit, they were lined up against a wall and shot so that their voices of protest could not be heard. Some of the young Englishmen who were similarly deceived and who did escape to tell the truth are shown here in London trying to be heard. There was no doubt about the importance the international communists attached to the final and total capture of Spain. Nehru came from India with his daughter Indira Gandhi to meet with the communist Colonel Lister, commandant of the 11th Division, and examine the battle plans. Krishna Menon was there, and the young American at the table entered Spain posing as a sculptor named Joe Davidson, though it is thought by some that he is another, later to become famous by his assassination. The communists from all countries marched through Madrid in November, shouldering their Russian, Czech, French, and English arms. Russian ships unloaded arms from Russia and other countries. They unloaded ammunition and rifles and wagons and tanks and cannons, airplanes, machine guns, and they turned this into a truly modern war. By far and away the greatest part of the foreign aid sought by the communists depended upon the falsification of the red identity of the forces behind the Republic at that time. This camouflage was to be achieved by infiltrating and or deceiving the news media throughout the world. From the United States, Ernest Hemingway and John Dos Passos came to write, and Herbert Matthews of the New York Times. This was the same Matthews who 15 years later, still with the powerful Times, could see no red in Mao Zedong, today's dictator of communist China. And it was the same Matthews who 25 years later would publish front-page articles in the New York Times proclaiming Castro to be the George Washington of Cuba, with no communist tendencies at all. Materially, the anti-communist forces of Franco found themselves with their backs against the wall before such a display of modern arms. They had nowhere to turn for help. The Western powers, Great Britain, France, and the United States, held to their official policy of non-intervention, although they did not prohibit the formation in their countries of battalions of volunteers to go help the Reds in Spain. To the communist leaders, at their luncheons and fiestas, the ultimate capture of Spain by their own forces appeared to be assured. The international brigades met and planned their strategy, and each day they carelessly showed a little more of their hand. Until Madrid was covered with their posters, and it became very hard indeed for an honest reporter to continue to refuse to see. These bodies are just a few of the monks, nuns, priests, and other religious figures dragged from their houses by the Reds and shot. But Franco's army made progress, and at last it approached Toledo and the road to Madrid. In Toledo was the Alcázar, where a tiny garrison of proud anti-communists with scarcely food nor water, had held out heroically for 72 days of daily communist siege. They became a symbol of bravery and resistance before all the civilized world. Taking the Alcázar became so important to the communists that they fired thousands of rounds from all angles to try to batter down the walls. Of the Red government, Largo Caballero, came from Madrid to personally supervise the siege. 2,000 communists were on the attack. Tunnels filled with tons of dynamite were exploded underneath the Alcázar. The constant bombardment made the task of holding seem hopeless, but still the garrison stood. Franco's troops advanced to make the rescue. And make the rescue indeed they did. Officers and men alike cried openly when they got there, seeing how faith and bravery had won the day. Malaga in the south is liberated from the Reds. The columns of the anti-communist forces of Franco are a miraculous, welcome relief. Bilbao in the north is next, but the war is by no means over, and even where the communists retreat, everything behind them is destroyed. But at last the northern red line is cut in two, and Bilbao is free. Little by little, other towns in the North Country are freed. Some must start over from ruins, such as Teruel, where the people are sent from the town by the Reds. Franco's cavalry wins the Battle of Alhambra. And Franco personally directs the victory over the communists at the Battle of the Ebro. Truly the decisive defeat for the Reds. After losing the Battle of the Ebro, the international communist apparatus could see that Spain was slipping rapidly from their hands. They ordered their international brigades home. The communists had learned much in Spain, how a brave resistance cannot be overcome, and they would apply their new knowledge cleverly in order to weaken the will of the people to resist. Here the brigades are in their last parade in Barcelona, before leaving for their respective countries to continue their subversion there and in other lands. Liberation is easier now, sometimes with no resistance encountered, even though the communists still occupy Barcelona and Madrid. As the towns are entered, one of the first things is to make sure that the hungry civilians are fed. At last, the forces of Franco enter Barcelona. Tanks and the troops of General Jaume. The communists are on the run. The advance of the Franco forces is so rapid that the retreating communists are forced to leave behind a part of their booty in the old castle of Figueres by the French border, where it is recovered. Box after box of privately owned jewelry stolen from homes and bank vaults. Treasures of gold and silver sacked from the churches by the Reds. bundles of worthless paper money, an original Greco, and cases of stocks and bonds. But most of Spain's gold and treasure reached Moscow and remains there still. Now the fighting was almost over, and it was time to take Madrid. Three bloody years of fighting communists from all countries in their own land, and once again the people are free. They had deceived themselves. They had broken faith with their own strong traditions to try the pseudo-intellectual new. They had let their streets fill with riots, and they had surrendered away their arms. They had turned from their God in impatience to listen to the voices of man. Of 21 million people, they could count over 1 million dead. But now they could beat their swords into plowshares and turn back their faces to God. They could reestablish their ties with their own traditions and history. It was rather like coming home. And they could help teach the world about communism, who and what the communists are. And they could say with their fellow Spaniard, George Santayana, "He who will not learn from the past mistakes made in history is condemned to repeat them again." And they could pray that in the lands of their friends, we will learn from what happened in Spain and maybe not have to repeat.